the curtain closes on this year's World Economic Forum in Davos, how are the world's leaders tackling the topics of free trade and protectionism? And as the U.S. slaps new tariffs on Chinese imports, is a trade war on the horizon? Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Xin. On Monday, the U.S. Trump administration announced new tariffs on imported solar panels and washing machines. Most solar panels in the U.S. come from China, the world's leader in solar power production. Trump's first major trade move of 2018 follows his campaign message to promote America first. But China reacted strongly over the new tariffs, saying it will resolutely safeguard its economic interests. Are we facing a potential trade war between the two countries? What will be Beijing's next steps, and what are the underlying causes behind a series of accusations from the U.S. administration towards China? Joining me today for the discussion are Professor Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation of the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Timothy Stratford, Managing Partner in Covington and Burling LLP's Beijing office and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative responsible for U.S. trade relations with China. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So as I mentioned, on Monday, President Trump announced this tariffs on imported solar panels and washing machines right before he goes to Davos to attend the World Economic Forum. Is there a connection between these two events? Why is he announcing these measures now? Tim?
I don't think there's a direct connection between the two events. I think that ever since the Trump administration began, there's been a kind of an internal debate in the administration about what are the underlying problems in the U.S.-China economic relationship and what to do about them. And I think that it was over the end of December, the beginning of January, that I think people in the administration finally came to a consensus, and President Trump has made some of his decisions. So I think this decision about solar modules and about washing machines is a first step, but I think that we'll see a number of additional steps that will be a reflection of the decisions that the administration's made.
So you talked about the underlying causes and a series of steps to take. What do you think are the underlying causes in the minds of the Trump administration officials in terms of trade relations with China?
Well, I think the first point to make is that this is not just a view of the Trump administration. I think that no matter who had been elected president of the United States, there would have been a strong movement to rethink some of the fundamental assumptions of how the U.S. deals with China on the economic level. And beneath all of this, I think there's a sense in the United States that China has evolved in its economic development and in its economic development model in a way that was different from what was originally anticipated when China joined the WTO in 2001. The Trump administration has gone so far as to say in a report issued a couple of weeks ago that they think it was a mistake for the United States to even support China's admission to the WTO. But even though people have different views about that, I think there's a consensus view in the United States that right now there are elements of China's economic development model that's kind of a hybrid of state intervention plus market forces. There are aspects of that model that the WTO doesn't really deal with very well, and that there are some problems therefore that need to be solved.
Professor Zhang, what has been the Chinese perspective on this issue? First of all, China reacted very strongly against these tariffs about imported solar panels. What is China's rationale in its reaction?
You know that actually before this time, both U.S. and the EU already conducted anti-dumping and anti-subsidies for solar panel made in China. That's a very big case for trade frictions. But this time it's called safeguard, special measures. Of course, from Chinese side, we are very disappointed on that. Also, we will say that we will protect ourselves, our own, interests, because that all of those economists, both in China and in the U.S., in the world, they know that the U.S. trade deficit against China, that didn't caused by currency exchange rate or China's trade policies. That's because China's economic structure as well as the U.S. economic structure. You know that in the U.S. More than 85% of their GDP from service sectors. So a lot of products they didn't produce. But in China, we can produce all of those type of products. So that's why in the U.S., most of U.S. people, they confess that without those products made in China, we can't live. But in China, we can, we have no this type of problems.
Basically, in terms of service trade, there is a trade surplus from the U.S. To China. But let us come back to the underlying causes that Tim was talking about, meaning the kind of consensus within the U.S. trade circle that China's economy has not gone in the direction that the world was perceiving that it might go, meaning going to a market-oriented direction. People are thinking that the state-owned sector is playing way too big a part in the Chinese economy, and that is why the Trump administration or any other administration that might be in place are rolling out these measures. What do you think of that?
I think that the rational, measures should rely on, rational consideration on trade and investment relationship. Given that, it's very clear, China's trade surplus will be keeping without measures. But I think that the right doing should be we will buy much more from the U.S. side. We already did that. We already made our promise before. This is one thing.
You think that's going to solve the problem of trade relations between China and the U.S.?
That's very important aspect. You know that from Chinese side, we promised in the near future we will buy more than $250 billion U.S. You know that within 1 year, China's trade surplus against the U.S. about maybe $300 billion U.S. That's a very big deal. But on the other hand, very important also, we need to invest much more in the U.S. And then, you know that for China's international payment account, that would be more balanced. But I very regret that is from the U.S. side, they are reluctant to sell their advanced technology products to Chinese side. This is one thing. That's very important terms. Another is that U.S. has a lot of measures prevent Chinese investors invest in the U.S.
Tim, listening to Professor Zhang's answers, do you think the concern of the U.S. administration are being addressed through the measures that the Chinese are proposing?
No, I don't think so. I think that if you look at the two economies, even though there is criticism in China now that some Chinese investment in the U.S. is being screened. In fact, the number of investments that have been screened, I think there have been 4 that have actually been blocked, in all these years. And in general, Chinese companies are freer to invest in more industry sectors in the United States than foreign companies are to invest in China. I think that because there's quite a discrepancy in that place, there are many in the United States that are calling for a reciprocity. There are proposals being considered now that say if a foreign company invests in the United States, it should be allowed to do so, provided that an American company could make a similar investment in that country. Right now, if you followed that measure, there would be far fewer Chinese investments in the United States than there are today.
Well, I understand the kind of need for reciprocity, but in the past 40 years since China's reform and opening up started, a lot of foreign companies were able to come into the Chinese market and make a considerable profit, even without China opening up some of the reciprocal steps. Isn't that, part of the ways that people can trade what they have for what they don't? So you don't need the exact literal reciprocity in order for two countries to benefit at the same time.
Well, I think the U.S. has been very slow to insist on reciprocity because there's always a cost of making your own market less open. And I think for many years the U.S. was willing to deal with China on a non-reciprocal basis, where the U.S. was far more open than China because the U.S. saw benefits and because China still had a relatively small economy. But now that China's economy is very large and now that China has aspirations to be a global leader in manufacturing in many sectors that are very important to the United States, the U.S. has to look and see whether China's measures are distorting the normal operations of markets. And if that's happening, then the U.S. will feel that there need to be some adjustments in the way things are done.
Professor Zhang, what is your take here?
Yeah, I think that right now actually trade issues becomes a political tools, for the Trump administration. In my mind, he claimed 1 year ago he claimed that he would add maybe more than 45% of tariff on those products made in China, these type of things. Also, we know that actually trade friction cannot solve problems, but trade war will make both two sides will suffer from that process. But even like this, they like to do this. So I think that...
are you saying that there is a trade war already happening between the two countries?
Right now we didn't say like that, but that will make all of us getting into trouble. You know that this time they use 201, this type of tools, but next time maybe 301, but from Chinese side maybe, and we will buy less a little bit from the U.S. side, and then friction will be bigger and bigger, and then trouble also will become.
Yeah. Tim, you were talking about this being the first step, and you foresee that possibly there will be step 2, step 3. What will be the logic? What will be the overarching theme of that, of the direction? Right.
So I think the first question is, what is the U.S. really concerned about? And I think what the U.S. is concerned about is that China's economic system is fundamentally different than the assumptions underlying the WTO system, and that because of that, it has had a negative impact on the U.S. economy. And there's a pretty broad consensus on that point, and you can look at the U.S. Commerce Department's study that they released in October that's 190 pages explaining their reasons. You can look at a document from the EU that was released in December, 460 pages giving their reasons. You can look at one issued by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office just a couple weeks ago, another 160, 70 pages explaining in very great detail what are some of the Chinese practices that move against a market orientation. So if that's the problem, then if you're the United States, you say, okay, China's become big enough and they become so committed to these tools that the current relationship is not sustainable. We need to do something. So then you have a choice. You can try to do things that you think will pressure or motivate or persuade China to make some reforms that you think are more consistent with the WTO system.
Do you think these measures, what we are seeing now, compounded by criticism and very strong-worded I wouldn't say threat, but criticism, let's say. Do you think these are the measures that can push bilateral trade relation to the right direction?
Not necessarily. So you have a choice. One is you try, your goal is to try to persuade China that there should be certain types of reforms in the Chinese system. Or another approach is to say, we don't think we can persuade China. They're very happy with their model. They probably won't care what the U.S. does anyway, so we need to instead try to shield ourselves from the damaging impact that some of China's practices can have. So those are two different approaches, and I think we have to see whether the U.S. is giving up on working with China, which would be a very drastic and I think difficult thing, or whether they're trying to work with China.
What does China think is the right way forward? I mean, China understands these concerns and China wants to work on these concerns, but what is the right way?
Firstly, I think that China is a WTO member. We also fully support the WTO regime, and we hope that both U.S. and EU should, implement, China, the tax of China's access to WTO. That means you cannot, use the third party to make assessments, surrogate. This is the first point. Second point is that for China itself, we already made promise to reform further. So this is also Liu He, claimed in
the Chinese representative in Davos.
Yeah, and we will promote our, market reform and development. But that's China's domestic, measures. In this regard, I hope that both the U.S. and those developed economies, they should understand that China is still a developing country. We need to have time to promote our reform and open up. But that should not be, the reason for trade friction and trade protectionism.
I'm sure there will be more discussions, and I guess, Tim, you would want to say more, maybe following on that, but we are running out of time this time. Thank you so much. We're going to leave it here. Our guests have been Zhang Jianping, Director General, Center for Regional Cooperation from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Timothy Stratford, Managing Partner in Covington and Burling, LPP's Beijing office, and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative responsible for U.S. trade relations with China. You have been watching The Point with me, Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that. This year's World Economic Forum comes to a close on Friday. As the crowds empty out of the Swiss town of Davos, what are the key takeaways from this year's meeting, and which leaders made the deepest impact? And how are different nations addressing free trade and protectionism under the event's theme of creating a shared future in a fractured world? Joining me for the discussion today is Dr. Ansgar Belke from Essen, Germany. He is Professor of Macroeconomics from the University of Duisberg-Essen and the Director of the Institute of Business and Economic Studies in the University of Duisberg-Essen. Dr. Belke, thank you very much for joining us. Now, one of the most challenging topics discussed at this year's World Economic Forum is inequality. The economic prospects for 2018 are predicted to be strong, and yet the divide between the world's richest and poorest is still startling. How are the world leaders tackling this issue from their speeches in Davos? And do you think what you have heard from their speeches are enough to address this issue?
So if we deal with inequality, the main insight was that the danger is protectionism, which makes the poor people even poorer. Another issue is the lower appeal of globalization, because they acknowledged that globalization is good also for the very poor. And you should always take into account simultaneous issues and also feedback issues from other countries. If you impose certain fiscal policies or monetary policies. And another result was that unconventional monetary policies served mainly the interest of the richer people, because they own all the assets whose values are pumped up. And you are right, and this was also recognized by the Davos participants, that wealth is very unequally distributed around the world. So the 1% richest people own more than the rest of the world. And the solution, as was recognized as well, is in growth. Because if you have growth, you get more people away from the poor income levels. So on the whole, the world would become richer if you serve growth. And you can serve growth. This was a key insight. If you want to focus on growth and foster it, you have to turn to institutional reforms, go away from bribery, you have to have financial development and all the other issues. And also gender participation was a topic at Davos. Look at a country like Japan, where the female labor force is not integrated into the labor market. You have to dispense with growth. So seen on the whole, inequality was mainly in the focus, and also the data issue. Big data has to be taken into account, and access of the poor to this kind of data has to be made sure, in the same way as a high quality of education. These were the main insights concerning inequality.
Mm-hmm. Arguably, where all eyes were on Davos this year was U.S. President Donald Trump, the first sitting U.S. president in 18 years to attend the forum. What do you think of his policies so far? Have they been helpful in building a shared future, or have they been facilitating or contributing to the further fracturing of the world?
So I think there are two sides of the same coin, and in Davos people also took into account both sides. On the surface, Trump is very unpopular because on the surface he seems to be very erratic, very difficult to model also for the IMF and the World Bank in their spillover models of the whole world. But if you look closer, at least his tax reform, which is meaning effectively fiscal expansion, is very much of a help for Europe, for instance, and the world economy, because the US economy is running at full employment right now. Capacities are fully utilized, and this is a big expenditure program and tax reduction, and this should unfold in additional purchases of goods in Europe. But a problem is, of course, the exchange rate. In a textbook way, the dollar should go up in value in order to for the US economy to buy additional goods. So we all expected the dollar going up, but it went down vis-à-vis the euro. And this shows again that also Europe used its chance to profit from this kind of isolationist strategies of Trump and move closely together. And this appears to be quite attractive for investors. So there are two sides of the same coin. Of course, Trump announced protectionist measures, started recently with respect to washing machines and some other stuff, which is kind of start of a currency war towards China. But for Europe, China has become more attractive for exactly that reason, as a partner on a world level. So it's difficult to judge up to now, and in part, Trump helped the European economy to recover. Look at the big growth rates which we observe in the euro area right now. We know this, the same stuff from the Reagan era in the 80s, where also the Star Wars program, expansionary fiscal policies, tax reductions were run by the US. But in a sense, this helped Europe, which at that time started with its monetary system. And so the US will become the locomotive of business cycles for the rest of the world, jointly with China.
So the IMF also predicted a strong economic growth forecast for the coming year, and China and US trade relations, as I talked about during the first half of this program, it seems that there are signs of growing trade friction, even trade war between China. So looking at putting all of these things together, are we seeing a new cycle in macroeconomic trends in the world in the next few years?
Yes, you are right. So if Trump will become active even more in the next months and years to come, we will see more protectionism, quite for sure. But this will be damaging for the US itself, because if you impose tariffs, imported goods become more expensive, and the competitiveness of the US will shrink. And at the same stage, it's interesting to observe that China is going for more multilateralist measures, which means it's integrating more economies, is going for multilateral negotiations, and just jumped in for the US, which is leading. You clearly see this, that China is incrementally, slowly, but determined, going for investment, FDI in Europe. Look at Greece, look at Hungary, and also look at the Silk Road and other measures, which are very positively assessed by the Europeans. So the US will isolate themselves at their own damage, and there will be new coalitions between China and Europe.
Let's talk about the relationship between Europe and the United States. While President Trump is promoting his America First ideas, both French leader and the German leader launched some people call thinly veiled attacks on President Trump's agenda and used their platforms to hail the potential emergence of a more independent and more integrated Europe. Is this another sign of the fracturing of the world, or do you still see it as two sides of the same coin?
I see it as two sides of the same coin, because clearly Macron, as he indicated in his speech in Davos, is using Trump as a vehicle to go for more EU governance, more intensive EU governance in the euro area. Macron is waiting for the new German government to be implemented. I think we will see a grand coalition in a few months, and it will be decisive how Germany reacts. But in the end, also Merkel indicated that she is against this kind of protectionism initiated by Trump. So they will move closer together, go for a common fund, a common finance minister, and some other common institutions, and are pushed towards an orientation more towards China, towards the emerging markets. And you see it already now that Germany joined also with Macron with his, its orientation towards China. Look at the German automobile sector, which profits very much from China's expansion. And so we see here, to a certain extent, two sides of the same coin. Of course, it's a pity that the US,
Yeah, I wanted to say the message China sent out via its representative Liu He's speech is that China promises to take steps to open up in four areas, namely finance, manufacturing and services, intellectual property rights, and expanding imports. And Liu He said that these measures will go beyond the expectations of international businesses. From where you are, from what you have found out with business partners in Europe, do you think these steps are enough to meet the expectations of European business leaders?
I think so. These are very bright prospects, and even the German Bundesbank is buying renminbi right now. I think China proves to continue on a very prudent way of opening up, as is typical of an emerging economy. You see multilateralism, you see it as a very strategic way as well, and but it's not too quick. It's slow enough, and you need this for emerging economy to overcome the step to an industrialized country. So we also closely observed in Europe the very slow steps to internationalize the renminbi, to opening up the capital markets in order to avoid bubbles. And bubbles are a danger for China, which is seen by European commentators to an increasing extent. Bubbles due to the huge degree of shadow banks existent in China, also due to the real sector, where also bubbles have emerged. But it seems as if China is prudently avoiding these bubbles to burst. And the chances, especially of my home country investors, are very high in China to profit from China's boom in the future. This has been in the past, and so I don't think that we should look for retaliation measures in Germany, because Germany tries to restrict enterprise acquisitions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ansgar Belke. We have to leave it there. I'm running out of time, but many thanks for your insight and your time. Professor of macroeconomics from University of Duisberg-Essen, Dr. Ansgar Belke. And you have been watching this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter and Facebook using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.